The house was already awake before I was. I could hear movement from down the hallway, cups clinking, low voices, the quiet confidence of people who knew exactly what the day would look like. I stayed seated on the edge of my bed, listening. Not because I was tired, but because I no longer felt any rush to join what was happening outside my door. This wasn't how mornings used to begin. Before I tell this story properly, let me give you a brief picture of where it ends, because understanding the ending changes how you hear the beginning. This is the story of a parent who was still living, still thinking, still capable, yet slowly stopped being consulted. Decisions about daily life, routines, and the future were made gently, politely, and completely without their voice. Not out of cruelty. Out of convenience. If stories like this matter to you, take a moment to subscribe. These stories are shared so quiet changes don't go unnoticed. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? My name is Robert. For most of my life, I believed that getting older meant becoming less busy, not less important. I believed that raising children well earned you a place of respect. Not control, but consideration. For years, that belief felt true. My children used to ask before deciding anything. Even small things. They checked in. They listened. I felt included, valued, present in my own life. I didn't need to be in charge. I just needed to be heard. That began to change so quietly I can't point to the exact day. At first, it was helpful. Someone reminding me of appointments. Someone suggesting a different routine. Someone saying, "Don't worry, we'll handle it." I welcomed that. It felt like care. I didn't realize how easily care can turn into control when no one notices the difference. One morning, I walked into the kitchen and realized breakfast had already been decided. Not what I wanted. What was best. I sat where there was space, not where I preferred. The conversation continued around me, flowing easily, confidently, without pause. No one was rude. No one ignored me directly. And yet, I felt invisible. That feeling followed me through the day. Through small adjustments that weren't discussed. Through plans mentioned casually, already finalized. Through phrases like, "We've decided," and "This makes more sense," spoken gently, without malice. I told myself this was normal. I told myself I was being sensitive. That age requires flexibility. That letting go was a sign of maturity. I didn't want to be the difficult parent. I didn't want to slow anyone down. So I stayed quiet. The strange thing about silence is how quickly it becomes expected. By the evening, I realized I hadn't made a single decision for myself that day. Not a meaningful one. Not even a small one that felt personal. Everything had been arranged, optimized, settled, efficiently and kindly. I went back to my room earlier than usual and closed the door. Inside that quiet space, something settled heavily in my chest. Not anger. Not fear. A realization that arrived without drama. My life was still happening. I just wasn't being asked about it anymore. And that was the moment I understood something had shifted, not in the house, not in my family, but in my place within it. This story doesn't begin with betrayal. It begins with good intentions, gentle voices, and decisions made for my own good. And that, I would later learn, is how control often arrives, without ever announcing itself. There was a time when being included felt natural. Back then, nothing important happened without a conversation. Plans were discussed openly. Opinions were exchanged, sometimes debated, often respected. I didn't need to win those conversations. I only needed to be part of them. That alone was enough to feel secure. I remember evenings when we sat together after dinner, the days slowing down around us. Decisions, big or small, were talked through without hurry. Where to go next week. How to handle something unexpected. Even disagreements carried a sense of balance. My voice didn't carry more weight because of my age, but it didn't carry less either. That balance mattered more than I realized. Trust grew quietly in those years. Not the blind kind, but the comfortable kind. The kind that forms when everyone believes they're on the same side. I trusted my children because they had always shown care. They trusted me because I had never used authority to control them. We met in the middle. I believed this was how families were supposed to work. As time passed, I noticed a shift, but not a troubling one. My children became more confident, more capable. They took initiative. They wanted to help. I welcomed it. After all, independence was something I had spent years encouraging. When they offered suggestions, I listened. When they volunteered to handle things, I stepped back. It felt like a natural exchange. They were giving support. I was giving space. That's how trust deepens, through cooperation, not resistance. I told myself that this was what growing older with dignity looked like. Not clinging. Not insisting. Allowing room for others to step forward. I was proud of that. Proud that I didn't need to hold control tightly to feel secure. There were moments, small ones, when I felt slightly uncertain. When advice sounded a bit more final than conversational. When plans seemed further along than I expected. But those moments passed quickly. I didn't question them. Questioning felt unnecessary. Even ungrateful. After all, everything was framed around care. Around concern. Around making things easier for me. And I believe that love, when it's real, doesn't need to be inspected closely. I trusted the tone. I trusted the intention. I trusted the history. That trust made it easy to say yes. Easy to agree. Easy to assume that my presence was understood, even when it wasn't directly acknowledged. I didn't need constant reassurance. I believed the foundation was strong. What I didn't see was how quietly roles can change when trust goes unexamined. Support began to feel like direction. Suggestions slowly became expectations. Not suddenly. Not harshly. Just enough to notice, not enough to resist. And because everything still felt polite, I adjusted. I told myself that flexibility was kindness. That cooperation prevented conflict. That being easygoing protected harmony. These beliefs had served me well for most of my life. But there is a difference between stepping back by choice and being moved aside by habit. At the time, I couldn't see that line clearly. I still felt safe. I still felt loved. I still believed that my voice mattered, even when I wasn't using it. Trust can be a powerful thing. It can hold families together. But when it's never checked, never clarified, never balanced, it can also make silence feel like the right response. And silence, once accepted, has a way of becoming permanent. The first time it happened, it didn't feel serious. In fact, it almost felt thoughtful. I had woken up later than usual that morning. Nothing unusual about that. The night before had been restless, and my body asked for more time. When I stepped into the kitchen, the day was already moving ahead without me. Breakfast was prepared. The table was set. A small note explained what I should eat and when I should take my medication. It was written neatly, carefully, with good intentions. I stood there longer than I needed to. No one had asked what I felt like having. No one had checked whether my routine still worked for me. The decision had already been made. It was efficient. Organized. Kind. I told myself this was helpful. Later that same day, another small change appeared. An appointment had been scheduled. I was informed, not consulted. The explanation came quickly, how it saved time, how it made sense, how it was better this way. I nodded. It didn't feel like a moment worth slowing down for. After all, it wasn't a major decision. It didn't affect anything important. Or so I thought. But something about it stayed with me. Not anger. Not resentment. Just a quiet awareness that something had shifted. A subtle sense that my life had begun to be arranged around me, rather than with me. The words used were always gentle. We thought this would be easier. This seemed like the best option. You don't have to worry about it. Each phrase landed softly, carrying care on the surface. And still, none of them asked what I wanted. I told myself I was overthinking it. That independence doesn't mean doing everything alone. That accepting help is part of growing older with grace. I didn't want to reject kindness. I didn't want to appear stubborn. So I stayed quiet. As the days passed, similar moments followed. A change in routine. A suggestion that felt final. A plan already in motion by the time I heard about it. Each one small enough to ignore. Together, they formed a pattern. I began to notice how often I was informed rather than included. The strangest part was how reasonable everything sounded. There was logic behind every choice. Time saved. Effort reduced. Risk managed. When care is presented that way, objecting feels unnecessary, even selfish. I adjusted without comment. I ate when meals were ready. I went where I was told it made sense to go. I accepted schedules that fit others more than me. Not because I was forced, but because resisting felt awkward. I didn't want to be the person who caused friction. That night, I sat alone in my room and tried to explain the feeling to myself. It wasn't loss. It wasn't anger. It was something quieter. A sense of being managed. I realized then that the most powerful changes don't announce themselves. They arrive as conveniences. As help. As improvements. And because they were the language of care, they're rarely questioned. I thought about how easy it had been to accept those first decisions. How natural it felt to step aside. How quickly my absence from the conversation went unnoticed. Nothing had been taken from me directly. I had simply stopped being asked. That was the moment I understood something important. Control doesn't always arrive with force. Sometimes it arrives with kindness, and stays because no one ever challenges it. After that first decision, the pattern became easier to recognize. Not because it grew louder, but because it grew more frequent. I began hearing about things once they were already settled. Plans mentioned casually, as if I had been part of the discussion even when I hadn't. The tone was always calm, confident, reassuring. There was no hostility in it. That almost made it harder to respond. When decisions are presented as finished, questioning them feels disruptive. So I didn't. Instead, I nodded. I listened. I adjusted. At some point, conversations started happening around me instead of with me. I would be in the same room, sometimes at the same table, while arrangements were discussed as if I were temporarily absent. My name might come up, but my opinion rarely did. It was subtle, polite, easy to miss. I noticed how often phrases like, "It's already handled," and "We've sorted it out," appeared. Those words carried a finality that left little room for response. By the time I processed what was being said, it was already done. I told myself this was efficiency. That everyone was busy. That it made sense for someone else to take charge. I had spent my life solving problems. I knew how tempting it was to just move forward rather than slow down for discussion. Still, something about it felt unbalanced. I realized I was being managed the way one manages a schedule, not respected the way one respects a person. My days were being shaped without my input. Not harshly. Just neatly. Even my preferences started to feel like inconveniences. When I mentioned liking things a certain way, the response was often practical rather than curious. "This is easier. This works better. You'll get used to it." Each response closed the door just a little more. I began choosing my words carefully. If something mattered to me, I weighed whether it was worth bringing up. Most of the time, it didn't feel like it was. Not because it was unimportant, but because it felt already decided. Silence became my default. The strange thing is how quickly silence can be mistaken for agreement. The more I said nothing, the more my quiet was taken as consent. My lack of objection was treated as approval. And slowly, my presence became symbolic rather than active. I was there. I was seen. But I wasn't shaping anything. I noticed how this changed the way I felt about myself. I hesitated more. I second-guessed simple preferences. I stopped making plans of my own because it seemed pointless to adjust them later. My world grew smaller, not in space, but in influence. What troubled me most was that no one seemed aware of it. From the outside, everything looked cooperative, harmonious, well organized. There was no conflict to point to, no injustice that demanded correction, which made my discomfort feel unreasonable. I told myself I should be grateful that many people my age would appreciate this level of involvement. That care, even when it feels restrictive, is still care. But deep down, I understood something important. Being looked after is not the same as being respected. And somewhere along the way, I had crossed that line quietly, without realizing it, until my life no longer felt like something I was actively living, but something that was being arranged for me. I didn't notice the shrinking at first. It didn't come as a loss of space, but as a loss of choice. Small choices. Harmless ones. The kind you don't defend because they don't seem worth defending. What time to eat? Where to sit? How long to stay in a room before feeling like you should move on? I began adjusting without thinking about it. If the house felt busy, I stayed in my room. If conversations sounded settled, I didn't interrupt. If plans were mentioned in passing, I assumed my role was to agree. None of this was asked of me. I did it because it felt easier than explaining myself. Over time, my routines changed to fit everyone else's comfort. I woke earlier so I wouldn't be in the way. I waited longer before using shared spaces. I learned which moments felt safe and which felt inconvenient. These weren't rules anyone gave me. They were habits I taught myself. I told myself I was being considerate. But consideration, when it only flows one way, starts to feel like disappearance. I noticed how rarely I initiated anything anymore. Outings, meals, conversations, even preferences. It felt simpler to follow along than to suggest. Simpler to adapt than to ask. My voice grew quieter, not because I had less to say, but because it felt less welcome. I began to feel like a guest in my own life. A polite one. The kind who cleans up after themselves, keeps their belongings contained, and doesn't overstay their welcome. The kind who thanks people for things that used to be normal. That realization unsettled me more than I expected. I had always believed that independence meant being able to do things alone if you needed to. I hadn't realized how much it also meant being allowed to decide when help was actually needed. Now, help arrived before choice. My days became predictable in a way that felt limiting rather than comforting. Meals appeared on schedule. Appointments were arranged. Activities were suggested with certainty. I followed along, telling myself structure was good. But structure without consent feels like confinement. There were moments when I wanted to push back. To say, I can decide this. Or, I'd like it another way. Those words formed in my mind but stopped before reaching my mouth. Not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. I was tired of explaining myself. I didn't want to sound ungrateful. I didn't want to seem difficult. I didn't want to create tension where none appeared to exist. So I let the moment pass, again and again. And each time it passed, it became easier for others to move forward without me. I began to notice how much I missed being asked. Not obeyed. Not indulged. Simply asked? That small pause in conversation that says, "What do you think?" Without it, something essential disappears. I still had people around me. I wasn't alone in the usual sense. But I felt isolated in a way that's hard to explain. Surrounded yet separate. Included yet uninvolved. My world hadn't collapsed. It had narrowed. And the most difficult part was this: I had helped it happen by choosing silence when my voice still mattered. By the time I realized what was being lost, it already felt normal. That's how shrinking works. Quietly. Gradually. Until one day, you look at your life and realize you're living inside a version of it that someone else designed, while you nodded along, believing that was the price of peace. The moment of clarity didn't arrive during an argument. There were no raised voices, no sharp words, no confrontation that forced everything into the open. It arrived quietly, the way most truths do when they'd been waiting a long time to be noticed. It was late afternoon. The house was calm, settled into its usual rhythm. I was in my room, sorting through a drawer that hadn't been opened in years. Old letters. Receipts. Small reminders of a life that once felt firmly my own. My hands moved slowly, deliberately, as if taking care not to disturb the order of things. From the other side of the wall, voices drifted in. They weren't hushed. They weren't secretive. They were practical. Confident. The kind of conversation people have when they believe everything has already been agreed upon. My name came up once, maybe twice, mentioned casually, like a detail already accounted for. I listened without meaning to. Plans were being discussed. Arrangements. Timelines. Things that affected me directly. Where I would be, what would change, how things would move forward. Each sentence landed gently, but together they formed something heavy. I wasn't part of that conversation. Not because I was absent. Not because I was incapable. But because my input was no longer considered necessary. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the drawer still open beside me. For a moment, I felt strangely detached, as if I were overhearing a story about someone else. Someone older. Someone less involved. Someone already decided for. That was when the truth settled in. This wasn't about help anymore. It wasn't about care or convenience. It was about control. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that grows when silence goes unchallenged. The kind that feels justified because it's wrapped in responsibility and reason. I thought back over the months leading up to this moment. The small decisions I hadn't questioned. The plans I'd accepted without discussion. The habits I'd changed to make things smoother for everyone else. Each choice felt harmless at the time. Together, they had shifted something fundamental. I had slowly handed over the authority of my own life. No one had taken it from me forcefully. I had stepped aside, trusting it would always be returned when needed. But authority, once moved, rarely comes back on its own. The conversation continued for a few more minutes. Then it ended. Footsteps moved away. Doors opened and closed. Life went on exactly as it had before. But I didn't. I closed the drawer carefully and sat there in the quiet, feeling the weight of understanding settle in my chest. There was no anger in it. No urge to confront or accuse. Just a clear, undeniable awareness of where I stood. I realized then how easy it is to mistake being cared for with being directed. How quickly concern can replace consent when no one stops to ask. How gently a life can be reorganized without ever checking if the person living it agrees. I wasn't being mistreated. I was being managed. And the difference between those two things is small in words, but enormous in how it feels. That evening, I went through the rest of the day as usual. I nodded when spoken to. I followed the routine that had been set. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inside, everything had. Understanding has a way of doing that. Once you see it, you can unsee it. I finally knew what had been happening all along. My future wasn't being discussed with me because it was already being decided without me. And the hardest part wasn't realizing it. It was realizing how long it had been happening, and how quietly I had accepted it. After that day, nothing around me changed. The house followed the same routines. Meals arrived on time. Plans moved forward. Voices stayed calm and polite. From the outside, it would have looked like a peaceful family handling things well. But inside me, something had settled into place. Clarity has a quiet weight to it. Once it arrives, it doesn't shout or demand action. It simply stays, asking to be acknowledged. I carried that clarity with me as I moved through my days, noticing things I had previously explained away. I noticed how often decisions were shared as updates, not conversations. How frequently my agreement was assumed instead of requested. How easily my silence had been interpreted as comfort. I didn't feel anger toward my children. That surprised me. I searched for it, almost expecting it to rise, but it didn't. What I felt was closer to grief. Not for what had been taken, but for what had slowly faded without anyone noticing. My role. I had believed that being a good parent meant stepping back. That not insisting was a sign of love. That harmony mattered more than having a say. And for a long time, those beliefs worked. Until they didn't. I understood then that dignity doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes when choices are removed gently, one by one, until a person forgets what it felt like to decide freely. I thought about the moments I had chosen silence to avoid discomfort. The times I had told myself it wasn't worth speaking up. Each of those moments had seemed small. Together, they had shaped my life. This wasn't about blame. It was about awareness. I began to understand that care should never replace consent. That love should never require invisibility. That being looked after is not the same as being respected. I couldn't change what had already happened. But I could change how clearly I saw it. And seeing it clearly gave me something back that I hadn't realized I was losing. My sense of self. I started paying attention to what mattered to me again. Not in loud ways. Not with confrontation. Just with honesty, first with myself. I reminded myself that being alive, present, and capable meant my voice still mattered. Even if it had been quiet for a long time. This story isn't shared to turn families against each other. It's shared because these situations rarely come from cruelty. They come from good intentions mixed with silence. From love that moves too fast and forgets to ask. If you've ever felt present in your family but absent from the decisions that shape your life, know this: you're not imagining it. And you're not alone. Awareness is not rebellion. It's protection. And sometimes, understanding what's happening is the first step toward keeping your dignity intact. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to subscribe. These stories exist to give voice to experiences many people carry quietly, and to remind us that respect should never disappear with age. Thank you for listening.